apart, which means it's got a pretty keen edge. When I brought it to a bone, I had some bone left over from a meal a while ago. It immediately started taking edge damage, and from there it progressively got worse in terms of edge damage. I took it to some cans, and the edge very easily would deform. It kind of rolled over in lots of spots. It didn't chip anywhere, as far as I can tell. It did, well, at least not noticeably. It all seemed to compress, to roll, to have deflections and things like that in it, rather than have chunks chip out of it. I did try bending the sword. If I just bent it one direction, it sprang back to shape, but a really hard smack on the side of the stand would cause it to deform and take a permanent bend. Hard smack the other way would get it to come back. But in terms of good results, so I've talked about some bad, namely the handle. Good results, the sword is still intact, and I tried breaking it. I tried quite hard. Now I brought it out to the croquet stake of doom eventually, smacked it into the croquet stake. It started deforming the edge. I hit it several times in the croquet stake of doom, and I don't think I could get a whole lot of gusto on it because it would turn very easily in my hand. And if I held it with two hands, my second hand would hurt. That tang would smack me in the palms, and it was very uncomfortable. I felt the vibrations in my hand. So I'm not swinging with a ton of authority, if you will. I could certainly have more zazz on it. But no matter how hard I hit, the sword did not break. When I turned it around, smacked it on the spine, it didn't break. I had to readjust the croquet stake of doom. It started to take my stand apart. That didn't work. So several strikes in the croquet stake of doom, still no sign of breaking. And my typical sword that I use to do some edge-on-edge contact, making it this far is very good in terms of durability. I couldn't get it out. It's frozen into my planter boxes, my garden. So I brought out the chunks of Anathar, the shards of Anathar, if you will, and I started striking that, then striking the spine on the croquet stake of doom. Now, this is typically a recipe to break just about any sword, and it didn't break this one. So I had to go even further, and I brought the sword and my camera and all that over to my planter box where the 1075 through hardened blade to do some edge-on-edge contact was frozen into the ground, and I struck it on that, and it actually broke that piece. It broke by shaking it apart, and the tang erupted off the broken sword in the ground. I continued to strike, but nothing basically broke this sword, and so it didn't come apart. I couldn't get it to break. What happened was both Makugi broke and the sword slid out of the handle, and I was left without a way to effectively hold the sword and test it. And knowing that I would have to swing really hard, that it wasn't just a couple light smacks on the croquet stake of doom, that I would have to be holding the bare tang and striking hard in my hand, is not a comfortable experience, so I stopped testing at that point. The sword survived. I was not successfully able to break it. I was only able to get it to a point where it was no longer comfortable, effective, or safe for me to test. It was no longer a weapon. The blade slid out of the handle and left me with no sword in the heat of battle. But I will say that the sword held up really, really well. Again, cold usually makes things more brittle. In this case, it didn't deform. It took lots of punishment. It took sword-on-sword contact. It took me striking both sides of the sword, deliberately trying to break it, and many swords have broken at this point. I suspect that that's because it's made of soft material. I don't know if I'm testing the HRC correctly, and I suspect that this may not be 1060, it might be 1045. I'm not exactly sure what it's made of, but the material does appear to be very soft. The edge seemed to deform relatively easily on cans and some of the other hard, but the bone and whatnot, it deflected and diminished the edge pretty quickly. And softer pieces tend to hold up better when I do aggressive testing on the croquet stake of doom, but the edge and material seems somewhat soft. It was springy enough to come back into place when I bent it, but overall, anyway, the sword held up well. It's reasonably forgiving, but it had some other issues. All right, sword friends, it is time for me to answer the question, do I personally think it's worth it or not? And the short answer here is no. And I break off at the hilt at all. None of the furniture components here, apart from the little tassel bit, came off, and the rest of it, despite the tassel coming off, this didn't come unwound. It did start to move around towards the crossguard area, though. Anyway, croquet stake of doom, it took a big hearty chunk out of the croquet stake, or the croquet stick took a big hearty chunk out of this, and it was penetrating about a millimeter and a half into with each strike, and honestly it didn't diminish much more than that, so it only cut in or reduced the finer points of the edge. And again, anyone with a competency in sharpening would be able to smooth those out basically and not get rid of the issues and give a good profile. You'd lose a little bit of the character of the blade, perhaps some of the meat, but it could certainly have been profiled and an edge could have been put back on it if you had some capability there. So it didn't cut in like 5 millimeters or something like that, but it did lose chunks with each strike into the croquet stick of doom, which in fairness is expected. That's typically what happens. Reversing it and striking on the spine, though, it didn't take too many hits to get it to break off. And I was striking down here, and it broke up here at one of the points where I was whacking earlier. And that's, honestly, it's a pretty thin blade. It's realistically what I expected, but a lot of times these softer blades that have a little bit more flex to them tend to last longer. It's worth noting as well that I'm testing on a colder day. It's a little above 30 outside right now. Stuff is melting slightly. So it's not quite freezing, but it's drifting in and out. It was snowing earlier today, freezing earlier today, and technically when I'm testing this, it's a little bit above freezing. So anyway, temperature may have affected it. Sometimes the cold tends to make things a little bit more brittle, though it wasn't exactly like I'm testing it in 20. Doing some more fun stuff, I moved on to like a bag of flour. I was expecting it to be more spectacular than it was. That wasn't necessarily so fun. But I also cut a shaving cream can, got some more of them. I smacked the shaving cream can, and really very little edge damage was present. There was the most minor little bit of glinting, I suppose, where it lost the keenest part of the edge, but not really. And it is a steel can, so it actually held up really well through all of those kinds of tests. And so that's really like the stuff it should do. I didn't have any tatami to spare on this one, so I didn't cut any of that. But pool noodles, cans and stuff like that, it cut all those well, didn't damage the sword. I didn't feel any rattles or any issues. And on the steel can, very minor issues were present, but overall I thought it held up to that basic level stuff just fine, and really, really quite impressively. Well, not necessarily impressively, it wasn't the greatest cutter, but it didn't damage itself, it didn't bend. No clear red flags were present at this point. So I started to do something a little bit more abusive, and I'm using the sword like an axe here. Now this is kind of towards the debatably abusive stuff. I brought out a big thick log. It's not going to cut through it. I just wanted to punish the sword a little bit. You shouldn't do this. This is certainly abusive in the sense that your sword should not come out of it necessarily unscathed. Dulling the edge would be appropriate for using it like an axe. Bending the sword or twisting it would be appropriate for smacking it into a log repeatedly with some force. All that stuff is appropriate. Some rattling on the fittings, especially after repeated percussive abuse kind of stuff, that would be appropriate. But that's not what happened. So I was hitting the log, and I was not expecting it to break. I did some thrusting into the log incidentally as well, and twisted. The edge and tip held up well. It didn't break off. It didn't fold the edge over on the very top of the point of the tip. So overall, it was doing pretty well, and just really wasn't expecting it to break. And that's when it did. I was smacking the log, and the tip broke off. So that was pretty much the end of the sword. At this point, the test turned into a destruction test. I was kind of thinking it would go further, but it didn't. I have some view of the cross section here, and the grain structure of the steel appears quite coarse. Anyway, just wasn't expecting it to break. It didn't break particularly spectacularly. The edge came off towards the top. I didn't notice any black spots or anything that indicated that there was a crack or something like that. It just appears that it was a little bit more brittle. So the edge held up maybe better than it would have if it were tempered a little bit softer. But it seems like some work needs to be done on the heat treatment to make it a little bit more resilient. So anyway, that's when I tested the quillions. I stuck it in the stand, and I smacked the quillions. They came off reasonably easily. They should bend. They should not crack off like that. And if you were again using this defensively, I think that the quillions might crack. So that was the testing. Hopefully that was helpful. It did stand up to some usage. Cutting water bottles and things like that seemed to be just fine. Cutting the steel can was fine, but abusing it kind of right when I got into the debatably abusive territory. Some people don't consider smacking wood to be abusive, but some people also expect a sword to cut through a tank and it to, go unscathed. So if you're cutting wood, then you might need to sharpen it. You might need to straighten it. But in this case, it just simply cracked. So anyway, that's what happened with the testing. Hopefully that much is useful to you. You can be the judge of if that's acceptable or not for $200. And that, I suppose, brings us to the part, do I personally think it's okay for $200? Would I say it's worth it? Well, as I noted, it was a roller coaster ride. I didn't expect. Now the edge didn't chip and spray off, but in a lot of places it did roll over. It still cut the bones, but at the same time there was a price to be paid for it. After cutting the bones, I thought, well, I'm in for penny in for pound. Let's push it all the way. And I did some more things. I threw it at a tree, no problems. Didn't notice really any rattle popping up. The habaki, I think, started to loosen at that point, but that was about the only thing that I could say really happened as a consequence of throwing it at a tree. No bends, no issues, no breaking, no other bits. So then I brought it out to the croquet stake of doom. And here is where I do want to point out I'm being pretty aggressive right out of the gate. Sometimes I start and I do some light wax, and I didn't have a lot of light wax with this one. So several strikes, and then I reversed the blade, turned it around, struck it on the spine, which is a recipe to break the sword. In my heart, I really hoped that it wouldn't break here. In my mind, I thought, like, this is going to go further, but a couple strikes on the spine, and it did break. So I've gotten better at breaking swords. I really hope that it didn't, but it did. And the fact that it made it that far to, cutting through bone, chopping a log, being thrown across across my yard several times into a tree, all of this is very good performance. It held an edge really well. It did really good at cutting. It was a pretty resilient sword. It didn't bend. But when it came to the croquet stake of doom, it broke like a lot of other swords did. So that, I guess, is really all the testing. What I can say from that is I do think that as I look at the grain structure, it appears pretty tight. There's not a particularly rough or coarse grain structure that I'm able to see as I compare it to some of the other swords that I broke anyway. that cut some logs and stuff like that with it, though. I noticed that I lost that hair popping edge. If I tried to shave with it again, remove some arm hair, that it wouldn't do the same thing. So it did lose some of that hair popping edge, but it would still remain sharp. I wouldn't want to run my finger across it, but it lost the shaving sharp edge, which is why I say, like, I'm not sure about the hardness. I was not having luck getting my 60 HRC file to bite into the edge as I was scratching it on the base, but when and the 40 file would bite in, so I have a feel for how they bite. Anyway, there's some mild scratches left over on it, which is the cause of metal, so maybe I'm misinterpreting the results. I digress, though. It did lose edge quicker than I think other swords have, but at the same time it measures quite hard, so I don't really know what to make of that. The other thing to note is when I was cutting into logs, it not only lost its edge, but it bent really pretty easily. Now, once a bend started, I did a big swing on a dry branch. It's not a particularly hard wood. I think this is either maple or cottonwood, but it's dried and hardened. It's not a small branch, and I cut into it, and it took a big S shape and twisted. It was one of the worst bends that I've had on any sword from cutting this type of material. And once it bent, it honestly just kind of kept bending from here. So if I brought it to other wood targets or something like that, I would see that it would just kind of be relatively soft and bend pretty easily. So I took and struck it on trees, and I could bend it, and it would take a pretty decent bend, and then I'd whack it on the side of the stand and bend it back. If I intentionally slapped it on the side of my stand, then it would bend quite a bit and take a set relatively easily. And the more I did it, the easier it was, and the more consistently it happened. So I didn't notice it on the tatami at all. I didn't notice it bend whatsoever when I cut into a big target, and didn't frankly cut through, so a lot of shock was absorbed by the sword. But later on, it started bending and kind of kept getting worse. So it's certainly on the softer side, and that's why, again, the HRC measurements that I took don't seem to really line up. Anyway, moving on from there, I threw it at the tree. It would bend sometimes. Overall, the handle and stuff stayed pretty solid, and it wasn't until I was throwing it at the tree, I believe that's the part where I started to notice that the handle was broken, and I could wiggle it around a little bit after throwing it at a tree. I cut a shaving cream can as well, more or less just because it's kind of fun. Well, it's fun. It makes for good camera footage. It left the same kind of characteristic scratches in the blade and diminishment on the edge, though the edge didn't take a lot of damage, didn't chip or roll as much as others have, but I could certainly notice that the edge was diminished and damaged. It would need to be sharpened, though it could still be sharpened and used and straightened at this point if that was something that was a concern. From there, I brought it to the croquet stake. I hit it once and then realized I should probably break out the brass fitting on the metal barrel. The croquet stake and brass fitting honestly gave really similar results in terms of damaging the edge. The croquet stake was certainly worse, but the brass fitting also damaged and pushed the edge back about 1 millimeter, not a huge amount, but it still pushed the edge back a little bit. I didn't notice chunks breaking off. It seemed to kind of chip off in some spots, but also roll a little bit in others, which again makes me think that I'm not measuring the HRC right, or maybe I just measured one spot and I should measure the spots that I'm actually going to be hitting, which now that I think about it is probably the fairer thing to do. I digress. Then I hit it on the brass fitting. It took some damage. From there, I brought it to the croquet stake of doom. It would bend, it would chip, it would do that kind of stuff, and eventually it broke. And in this case, it broke before I had to switch it and strike it on the spine. It broke striking edge first, which is not something terribly common, particularly not something common on softer steel. They tend to be more forgiving, take a lot more bends before they crack. And it flew off also in a direction that I was not predicting. So it's the reason I'm wearing the face mask and the thing over my vitals is, they fly off in weird directions and it's easy to hurt yourself. So don't do this at home, right? Anyway, that's where it broke. It broke quicker than honestly I would have expected for something lighter, and that was a little bit on the surprising. It didn't take a whole lot of edge damage up into beating it on the croquet stake of doom. You kind of could sharpen out or reprofile the edge and straighten the sword out and still have it be totally functional, but it eventually failed pretty catastrophically and flew off again prior to me having to strike it on the spine. And the pommel basically popped off. It didn't really cut the water bottle particularly well. Odd that it cut the pool noodle reasonably well, but didn't cut the water bottle particularly well. From there, I tried some more abusive things, and so I would cut into a log, and it cut deeply into the log, and nothing really was particularly broke or damaged from there. The sword seemed to be holding together, minus the pommel thing. But eventually the sword did take a bend in one of the bad cuts, and I struck it on the side of the sword, and I would notice that the blade would basically take a bend pretty easily. Striking on the side, the flat, I could bend it to and from pretty easily, and I could set it back, and it was pretty soft. Just some light taps would set it back, some light taps on the side would give it a reasonable bend. From there, it cut logs reasonably well. I can't tell necessarily if it was bending backwards a little bit. It might have been doing that. I didn't really kind of double check myself in that way, but it may have been taking a deeper bend or curving more deeply and striking into the logs. But it didn't always take a set if my angle alignment wasn't so bad. And throwing it at a tree, as I noted earlier, it would bend a little bit. Some pieces would loosen up, but most importantly, one of the quillions broke off. That exposed that they were basically a shell filled with some sort of epoxy resin, and that doesn't seem like an effective way to break or to make a quillion. In fact, I've never had a quillion break on throwing it at a tree before, so that was a new experience for me. Subsequent strikes caused the pitch to come off. Eventually, throwing and striking at things caused the handle to basically explode altogether. I continued to strike. I struck it on a brass fitting. First I struck it on the croquet stick of doom, saw the damage, moved to a brass fitting, and it kind of held up on all of those types of things. It didn't take a significant amount of damage, but the secondary bevel here is a pretty obtuse edge, so it's no terrible surprise. It did deform pretty quickly on the croquet stick of doom, though. Moving back to the croquet stick of doom, subsequent strikes would basically cause little bits to roll, some chips to come out, and overall it would pretty much deform. Now, in using this, I noticed that the handle pretty much came apart, and I thought, well, that's pretty much done. It hurts to move at this point. The handle is pretty small, and a lot of vibration is hitting my hand, and I was going to stop. And later I noticed that the handle basically came apart, and that's when I pulled it apart, and I saw the tang of the blade, or at least some remnants of the tang of the blade. And I see these little cuts in the tang that reduce the size of the tang and are meant likely to fill with glue so that it holds together. But there's basically something that's about a quarter inch wide and deep that is holding the entire sword together, or maybe less. And this little nubby tang spot broke, and that's what eventually I was able to pull apart from the grip. And this is one of the things that made me honestly mad. This is a cable Damascus blade of reasonable thickness, made to be used, and in the base of the tang, there's this little nubby part. It's cut, and failure points are built into the tang. Further, there's this very small piece that's really at a critical point, absorbing a lot of force, that's made to hold it together. That's a quarter inch by a quarter inch or less. It seems incompetent, frankly, and it seems dangerous, and it seems like something that shouldn't have left the factory floor. This is not an acceptable way to sell a functional sword. If that's what these were intended to do, perhaps it was just meant as a wall hanger, which I would wonder why it's tempered and sharpened and all of that kind of stuff, if that's the case. But if this is a functional sword, this is not an acceptable thing to sell to people. So that actually that made me a little frustrated. I was optimistic at first. I thought, well, it cut a pool noodle, and then kind of quickly brought to reality as this thing fell apart in my hands. So I did strike it on the croquet stick of doom, though, several times. I did strike it on the spine several times, and the blade didn't break. So after doing those tests, I thought, well, at least the blade held up. If it weren't for incompetence in manufacture on the hilt and the tang assembly, maybe there's something to the blade. But on closer inspection, I did see that there are some very significant cracks in the blade. And that struck me as odd. I thought, well, it's very strange for a crack to be that deep and for the blade to take as much punishment as it did and not break. I thought it was pretty close to breaking. So I went out another day, put a glove on, wrapped the blade in a towel so I could strike along the spine. And it took actually a reasonable amount of effort to break the sword apart. It eventually did break. It deformed quite a bit, but it took a lot of energy to break the sword in half. So kind of takeaway for me is that this cable steel and the tempering that they're doing is a reasonably effective way to make a sword, in that the edge was held up reasonably well. It was soft, but it could be bent back and used as a weapon. It's not the best steel. I'm not going to argue that's the case, but this cable did really hold things together, particularly where it was soft. Now, where the edge was harder and where there were some spots that were presumably of a higher HRC, it cracked, and the cable didn't really seem to offer much in the way of failure protection. But as it moved back into the spine, this blade, for being a soft blade, was very hard to break. It took a lot of energy to split these cracks apart and pull this blade apart. And the cross section, it looks like it's coarse and rough, but I don't really know what to make of it, honestly. It doesn't look great, and so the cable may offer some benefits as a material to use when done even poorly. There seemed to be some resilience in here that the blade wasn't really deserving of. Anyway. That was the experience of cutting. It did make it all the way to the croquet stick of doom and then some. I brought it over to the tree. It's got some logs and branches stuck there for future cutting videos, and I just chucked it at the tree. Now, this is a dumb thing, and in fairness, all the things that I've done here are dumb. Water bottles are pretty soft. Cutting tree branches, that's not what a sword would likely encounter, but theoretically a sword might encounter spears or something like that. So cutting 1 inch to 1.5 inch thick bits of wood, or softer kind of green wood, like I'm cutting in a 2-inch variety, quasi simulates that, not in a real degree, but it's a thing that a sword might encounter on a battlefield. Cutting into a 6-inch log is not so much the case. Throwing the sword at a tree, if you drop your sword off your horse or something like that, or you lost it and somebody struck it out of your hands, theoretically might encounter that kind of force. These are all very feathery, not exact tests, even if you want to call them tests. But that's kind of the thought process behind it. Now, I thought when I started this that when I threw it at a tree, it would break or chunks would come off. That didn't happen. Nothing actually even loosened that much, though it did loosen around the Suba and the Habaki a little bit. But that was really it, and it took some big bends when it struck the tree and stopped. It turned into something that resembled a horseshoe by the end of it. Anyway, at the end of throwing the sword, I straightened it out and then moved on to the next most abusive thing, which is striking into the brass fitting on a barrel. Worth noting that the brass fitting, actually, it cut into it pretty deeply. I don't usually measure this kind of stuff, but it's just worth noticing that it cut through into the center of the fitting when I struck it. Edge damage was apparent, though. Right away I could tell that the edge took some significant damage. Sword edges don't always take damage here, is worth noting. Even differentially hardened ones, sometimes they strike the barrel and there's very minimal damage. Here there was some significant deflection right at the end. After several strikes, there was some small chipping. I would say it could be sharpened out at this stage, though. It's not so damaged that you couldn't keen it back up, but it would take a little bit of work to do anything. It's not going to polish out, but you could theoretically sharpen it and still have a functional edge ready to go for another battle. When I took it to the Croquet Stake of Doom, this is where things unraveled pretty quickly. So one strike in, I struck lower on the Croquet Stake of Doom to kind of show the damage. It was very similar, actually, to the brass fitting on the barrel. Not too much more damage. Several more strikes, though, and the blade snapped, basically. And it snapped. It's worth noting as well here that the lamination likely held it together because it snapped and broke. And I didn't notice until I struck it again, and then it peeled open quite a bit more where I noticed and slowed down and stopped. And even then, the lamination along the spine continued to hold, and I could do the final snap. But it was really only 5 or 6 strikes in total on the Croquet Stake of Doom before the blade snapped. I did have to turn it around and strike it on the back, which is frankly what I would have liked to see. Now, differentially hardened blades, par for the course or acceptable is a few strikes. The fact that it made it to the Croquet Stake of Doom is a good thing and a testament to durability. Some swords don't make it to the Croquet Stake of Doom and break doing other things. This did not. However, ideally, it takes several strikes in the Croquet Stake of Doom, and I have to turn it around on the spine to strike it and open up those cracks. That didn't happen here. I would have loved if that was the case. It didn't take very many strikes. And unfortunately, that is kind of what I was expecting, but at the same time, I would have loved it if it lasted a little bit longer. So anyway, that is what it took to definitely abusive territory wherein I'm throwing it at a tree. And I understand throwing it at a tree is not a scientific test and it's not a historical one, but it does put a lot of shock into the sword. And if I can throw it at a tree about 10 times and actually hit the tree, or even if it hits the dirt and it holds together, it's usually a pretty well-made thing, and there's a reason that it holds up. And if something breaks, it sometimes, because of all that shock, can expose failures in the sword, and I think that's what happened in this case. So what happened from throwing it at a tree? Well, the tip bent, and I didn't bother bending it back, so there's no cool glamour shots of it sticking and penetrating deep into the tree. The tip bent, kind of folded over, and it was almost like a feather tip at that point. But I digress. Point is, I threw it at a tree. The crossguard started to deform, and you can see in the crossguard there's some metal fatiguing that appears to be present here. I've seen this on other Ronin katana swords as well. That's why I think they might be made of the same type of alloy. Regardless, the crossguard held up, but it did deform substantially more doing this than it did in some of the other tests. Also, the blade seemed to flex. There were some times that it did hit directly on the tip, and the blade would flex, and it still stayed straight, so the blade didn't bend off at all. But at some point, the pommel did crack, or something like that. I threw it at a tree several times. It struck on the flat, it struck on the pommel, it struck on the blade. I missed the tree a few times, but eventually something happened that caused the pommel to crack in such a way that when I threw it, the pommel came off before it hit the tree, and I was able to find it in the snow, and the peen appears to have broken off like just before the end, because I can still make out the area where it appears to be peened, but the tang cracked in such a way that the peen came off. Now, I had forgotten that the owner or the manufacturer had mentioned that there's a peg that runs through the grip, and that would have held it on in such a way that I could have continued, but I think the grip actually, or that peg, also failed because there was quite a bit of space between the crossguard and where the grip had come off, or where the pommel had come off. The grip had slidden around a little bit, and that indicated to me that that bamboo peg had failed. It's also a bamboo peg. It's not particularly resilient, so maybe a brass peg or something like that would have kept it a little bit more secure. But that additional reinforcement certainly I think kept the entire grip assembly from coming off, as well as some of the epoxy and stuff like that, kept things pretty tight in there. Theoretically, I could have continued. I didn't feel like it was safe, though. To me, the pommel coming off is a critical failure. Throwing it at a tree, and I did this a few times. It's a bit of a slog to get through the snow, so I didn't do it too much, and I didn't notice any issue. Now, there was an issue that actually likely happened here that I missed. I didn't notice any bending, I didn't notice any edge rolling, I didn't notice any issues with the blade or bending, but there was likely a bend here that happened in the hilt, as well as there was some chunks that came off of the grip. And note that I'm throwing it without the pommel. I left that inside because it had already come off. This likely wouldn't have happened if the pommel had been attached and secured properly, but my pommel came off, so it was able to bend this little flange area that normally overlaps the pommel a little bit. Apart from that, the hilt bend is what I missed. I did notice the degradation in the grip material, but I didn't notice that the hilt had bent. Anyway, didn't notice any other problems. It held together. There was a slight rattle in the grip. That was really about the only things that I noticed from here. The hex bolts, or the Allen bolts, I'm not sure what they're called, the little things that I have to take out with an Allen wrench that are holding the grip piece on. They were a little bit loose. I didn't notice that until I went in and actually started to take them off. They came off pretty easily and weren't tight anymore. That was probably contributing to the looseness in the grip. At the same time, to their credit, they held on and didn't come off through the duration of my aggressive testing. From there, I went to another tree that I need to take down, tried to bend the blade. It didn't bend with pressure. It didn't bend really much at all. It doesn't have a lot of flex to it. It's a pretty thick, robust blade. I chopped into this dead tree a few times, didn't notice any edge degradation, and from there, I attempted to bend the blade. And bending, I slap it on the side of a tree or something like that, and sometimes it will, even with through hardened blades, develop some sort of set or bend. I didn't notice that happen, but in pretty short order, the blade broke, and while I was slapping it on the side of the blade with, I would say, some force, but I would call it like a medium force. I'm not really swinging that hard. My elbow doesn't really let me do it that much, but I'm swinging hard enough that I wouldn't want to get hit that hard. So call it what you will, though. I would argue that it shouldn't have broken here, but it did, and in examining the grain structure, I was unable to recover the tip. I still have no idea where it is. I went out with a magnet. I was looking for it and still couldn't find it, so that'll be a fun spring project. But the grain structure didn't appear particularly coarse. It looked okay to me. To strike the sword and stuff like that. I didn't notice any bending despite my efforts hitting it with a club and throwing it at a tree. Again, the suba bent, the kashura bent, but the sword itself didn't bend much at all, other than some tip deformation from hitting the ground and me throwing it basically into the frozen dirt, which is full of rocks and whatnot. There's a gravel area there, and I believe I hit a rock with the tip, and it had some minor issues there. But overall, pretty minor stuff given what was done to it. Then I brought it to the Tree of Woe, as I'm coming to call it. Other swords have broken on this tree. I did some strikes into the tree and then struck the flat on the sword, and relatively quickly the sword broke. Now, it's worth noting that on this particular section of tree, I would say that despite how well the sword held up, is a bit of a surprise failure on the sword's part. I would have liked to see it bend, I would have liked to see it twist, or I would like to see it take many more strikes into the tree before it deformed, but I don't really expect it to break in half on this part of at least the way I'm doing. More abusive side of things, as in throwing it at a tree, this is where it started to have some problems. So again, I lost the little bone bits on the side, and I threw it at a tree several times. Sometimes I even hit the tree. Other times it kind of flew off or went into the ground. But I didn't notice that the tip was deformed from being thrown and driving itself into the ground. It hit the side of the grip and the side of the blade a few times, and apart from the little riser, the little bone fragments in there, it didn't look like it was having too much trouble. The last throw, though, did show a bend, and it bent the sword near the base of the blade, the thinner part of the blade, just above where the crossguard portion ends. A couple slaps, though, and it was back to straight, and I could continue on with the abuse. So I then brought it to the Tree of Woe, and the Tree of Woe has gotten that name because it needs to come down. It's very ugly, and it's also broken a few swords. So I slapped it on the side of the tree, and several slaps, the sword would bend, basically, and it's soft enough where it's bending near the ricasso area, or not the ricasso, but that thinner part of the leaf blade, and then it's also bending in the meatiest part of the leaf blade as well. So it takes a bend, but it's not breaking in half. And when I really wound up and struck it, that's when the grip came apart. Now, again, normally I would typically stop. The grip coming apart is a critical failure, and it doesn't leave me a lot of room to continue. But in this case, Swordford Matt wanted me to push it all the way to failure, to test the steel more rigorously, and so I did. I took a piece of shirt that I had wrapped around a water bottle that I cut. Incidentally, you're able to cut water bottles with old sweaters around them. It cut through fabric and whatnot really well as well. Anyway, I wrapped that around to use as a makeshift handle, and I brought it to the Croquet Stake of Doom. So the Croquet Stake of Doom is a mild steel rod, basically, that I put into my stand. I hit the croquet stick of doom. In the first couple whacks, it basically just, it takes less than a millimeter out of the edge. I'm actually really impressed with the edge retention here. This is something that even I could sharpen out. It didn't seem all that cumbersome to resolve. It was pretty minimal damage for what I typically see to the croquet stick of doom. And given how well it cut through pool noodles, I really wasn't expecting it to, I thought it would take more damage than it did. I thought the edge was more fine, but it had enough meat behind the edge where it really wasn't taking that much damage from the croquet stick. But when I leaned into it and struck it several more times, eventually the edge or the blade broke in the thicker section of the leaf blade. And that was a little bit surprising. I thought I'd have to reverse it and turn it around and strike the other side. I didn't have to do that. It was just several meaty swings into the croquet stick of doom, and eventually it broke apart. Now, again, ideally, I flip it around the reverse side and it still doesn't break, and then I have to take it on edge v edge sword and then flip it around and bring it back to the croquet stick. In an ideal world, I have to start diminishing the sword with tools because I can't break it. So getting to the croquet stick of doom is an accomplishment. Not every sword does. But breaking as quickly as it did is a little bit disappointing, but still well within reason. Or come off. Subas often will shatter or have other issues, and obviously the sword did take some damage here, but not really a lot. The tip went in the ground and developed some sort of edge damage because I believe the tip was thrust into the frozen ground, and there are rocks down there, so not a terrible surprise. The Suba bent, but overall the sword was still in usable shape. No bending, no twisting, no edge damage with the exception of the Kisaki, and obviously the sword still maintained itself as a weapon through being tossed at a tree. Now, it's not a scientific thing being tossed at a tree, especially when you throw it as bad as I do and don't hit the tree every time. But what it does tell you is if you were a samurai on horseback and you lost your bow or your spear or whatever you were actually using, you were going at it with your sword and you dropped it or lost it, then conceivably similar amounts of torture could be had in that kind of experience. So if you lost your sword, dropped it, if it got flung or smacked out of your hand, similar kinds of shock could happen as it impacts from that kind of activity. So ideally it holds up to that, and for the most part I would say it did. The Suba theoretically could be straightened out, but also you could take this sword apart and replace it with something else if you were concerned about the metal being fatigued, which frankly I might be. I was impressed though that it held up and walked away with as little damage, particularly on the handle. I was expecting more to happen, and honestly I was expecting the Suba to fold over even more or break off entirely, and neither was the case. So then I brought it to the Tree of Woe. Now bear in mind that I am testing this on a day that was a little bit above 20, but between 20 and 30 degrees, more towards the 20-degree side, I believe. And so it's pretty cold outside as I'm testing this. And the Tree of Woe has gotten its name because slapping swords on the side of the blade has broken a few times. There's been a sword from United Cutlery, a sword from Cloudhammer, people that seem to do reasonably well with heat treatments, and slapping a sword on the side of the tree has yielded results where the swords have basically shattered, like the tree's got some hidden metal in it or something. I've looked, it doesn't, but anyway. Basic gist is I was able to slap this on the Tree of Woe several times, really leaning into it, the same way I've broken a few other swords, and this one bent. It deformed a little bit, but it developed a slight set. After 10 licks, I gave up, but I did really lean into it. I hit it pretty hard, especially towards the end, and the sword did take a bend, but it did not break. Moving on from there, I brought it over to the Croquet Stick of Doom, which is a mild steel rod. Striking the Croquet Stick of Doom, basically it jutted into a pretty fine edge. It cut in about a millimeter and a half in terms of damage and how far in it impacts. After it rolled the edge or deflected or chipped off the edge, most of it is breaking off, though there are some areas that look like deflections. It only goes in about a millimeter or so, and conceivably I would be able to sharpen these out. I could reform the profile of the edge a little bit and be able to even fix the damage that was here. It maintained itself as a weapon for quite some time. Now, further strikes, though, eventually it did break, and what's notable is I didn't have to reverse the sword and strike it on the spine. It'd be nice if, I guess in an ideal world, like the top-notch ratings for swords on their Croquet Stick of Doom would be if I have to give up on hitting the Croquet Stick, go whack another sword on edge-on-edge contact to diminish, or use some sort of other tool, then go back to the Croquet Stick and break it. I didn't have it should be. But that changed a little bit when I started moving into some of the more aggressive targets. So from there, I brought it to an aluminum shaving cream can where I struck down at kind of the thickest part of the can, and very little edge damage was sustained. So it took some, but I would call it relatively minor, all things considered. And again, I'm not cutting into the thin kind of sidewall of the can. I'm cutting straight down into the kind of meatier steel part of the can. So that's where I noticed relatively little edge damage, all things considered, and so I thought that that was impressive. Further, when I took it to the croquet mallet of doom, so to speak, the new guest star on the channel here that I use for sword breaking, it kind of bit into that relatively well. Honestly, I was kind of surprised at how deep it was cutting into the mallet and how much metal it was taking off there, but it didn't do a whole lot of damage to the sword. It took a lot of strikes on that mallet, and gradually the edge would chip off. It would roll in some spots, which is again expected when you're striking into a softer metal target with a differentially hardened blade. Little chunks are usually going to break off, and then theoretically they could be polished out, they could be sanded, but if you can refine that edge, you can still have a functional sword. That's obviously not the goal here. I'm pushing it to failure, but basically I struck it along the edge several times, and while chunks would break off, it didn't exactly take any damage that couldn't theoretically be fixed by a polisher or by reprofiling the edge. Turning it on the spine and striking hard against the spine started to open up cracks. Another note here, the kashra has come off. And this is usually the recipe that I use to break swords. So I do lots of hard strikes against a metal target that's putting a lot of shock into the sword, and likely some cracks are forming that I'm not able to see. When I flip it around and strike it on the back, those cracks widen, and it's a recipe for failure on just about any sword that I've tested. So in this case, it's one of the first times where I've seen a pretty wide crack that looks like, okay, failure is imminent, and turned it around and had to take several more strikes, been able to flip it back around, strike it several more times, and then turn it around and hit it some more before it's broken, at least in a katana style blade. So I thought that was actually really, really impressive. I was really surprised at how much beating it took once a crack formed. Basically, once that happens, it's likely going to break. That's the expectation. It's just be wary of the helicopter of death that's imminent. Try not to be in its path, but expect failure very shortly. And you can see in the video that I'm striking several times after it's cracked, and it's still maintaining some sort of presence as a weapon. So I thought that was pretty cool. That I thought was impressive and somewhat redeeming in the maybe easily bent section. I was not particularly impressed at how easily it took a set. I wouldn't call it easily. I was abusing it. That's not fair to say that it was easily. But it did take a set on some aggressive targets. I thought it would have been nicer if it stayed straight, or at least I would have found it impressive. I was impressed by how durable this was once it cracked. Hopefully you never get there. Hopefully your sword isn't cracked, and if it is, I wouldn't advocate that you keep using it, but I was impressed that it maintained itself in some sort of weapon-esque posture for as long as it did after it had multiple failure points on it. So that much was impressive. If you imagine a battlefield scenario, which obviously this wasn't on, of a sword from history, I wanted to, theoretically they might impact pole arms or meet some sort of log. Obviously it's not an axe, it's not going to chop through the logs, I'm not expecting it to, but how well it fared in terms of maintaining an edge as well as maintaining its shape is something I was certainly interested in doing. From a historical perspective, this obviously is using a different kind of steel and is likely going to perform better than the historical version would, but to see how well this steel was treated, I thought logs would be a good place to start. So the edge didn't diminish substantially. It did take a set, or rather it would bend if I did kind of sideways strikes and really struck poorly against a log. A lot of shock is absorbed by the sword in doing this, and in chopping wood and other things. It's not necessarily completely ahistoric in the types of impacts that might be encountered on a historical battlefield or something. You could be striking into shields or pole arms, or you could make a bad strike into something that isn't ideal, and the sword could absorb a lot of shock in that case. Probably not from a log, but the apparatus that I'm using to test things isn't exactly scientific, but it's also not completely stable, so the log moves and things like that too. So anyway, I'm not saying that chopping into a tree is a scientific measurement or that people did that historically speaking, but the shock that the sword encounters from doing that could theoretically be encountered in a similar capacity on a battlefield. So while it's not terribly representative, it does give some idea of how well the sword is absorbing that shock. And right away, there were a couple things that I noticed happened. One, the little dragon head came off, and I've lost some of the accompanying bits. I'm not entirely sure how this was originally attached. It looks like it had some sort of little tongue and some sort of slot that went in and was surrounded by the bamboo peg at the end of this bit here. And I'm not sure, because all of those parts are lost to the to my backyard, and I can't find them. But the dragon head popped off relatively quickly. And it's at this point, like, that's the first real downside in looking at the kind of grain structure, if you will, of this cast piece. It looks pretty porous or pretty large in grain size, and I don't really know what to expect there, but it did come off pretty easy and pretty quickly. I wasn't holding it or really, putting a lot of pressure on it. There's just a lot of shock in the sword, and that's what likely made it pop off. In any respect, though, that was kind of deterrent number one. But I would say I felt comfortable continuing, because I can see that, one, we had a little ring around the base of the handle. We also have two kind of rivets in place on the handle, so I felt like, well, the pommel might have popped off, but the handle is still secured. I still feel comfortable in continuing, and that's an important thing, because this is a bit of a roller coaster ride of destruction, and some unexpected stuff happened to me where I would have given up. I mean, you've probably seen other destructive testing that I've done where I've given up when the pommels come off, but in those cases, I wasn't sure that the sword handle was secured in any other way, and it could fly off, and that would be obviously dangerous for me and for the things around me. So in this case, though, I can clearly see that the handle is fixed in another way. I felt comfortable continuing despite the loss of the handle. Throughout the rest of the wood cutting, I would say that more bad things happened to the handle. There might have been some cracking or something like that, but I didn't really notice anything not fitting correctly or loosening, frankly. And while the blade would bend a little bit, it was easy to correct, and overall, I would say it held up pretty well. From there, I started to do more aggressive targets. And so one thing, shaving cream can, I cut into that. Didn't notice really anything on the edge. I don't even think I bothered to take video of the actual sword itself afterwards, but I didn't spot any edge damage from cutting into the shaving cream can, which incidentally I've said is aluminum in the past, but I left one outside accidentally and it rusted, so I think it might be a steel can. It's not a particularly thick gauge of steel though, so I don't know how helpful that is. And I cut into the sheet metal side, the thin wall of it, rather than the top this time, so not particularly hard on the sword necessarily, particularly with the wide edge that this blade has. I moved on to a steel pole after that, or not a pole, but it's the croquet stake of doom, and it's just basically a mild steel cylinder of metal. It's solid mild steel, and wagging the sword into that, it would deform and roll, but not substantially. Like a millimeter and a half was about the deepest it went, and theoretically you'd be able to reprofile the edge and get right back and going. I didn't notice any major issues. So this is where my athleticism really starts kicking in, and I am throwing the sword at the tree. You can see that I miss the tree just about every time. And no surprise there, it's still actually useful. I'm trying to damage the sword, and I'm certainly achieving that. It's degrading the handle. Any remnants of copper pieces that might have been, or copper or bronze or whatever material the pommel is made out of, are pretty much gone from the handle. The little brass bit at the end comes off, and the sword is degrading more so from the handle. The epoxy is still holding the wood together at this point, but the handle is degrading. The sword is absorbing a lot of shock, and to its credit, it's not really bending or degrading any more than it already was. It's holding together through this, which does put a pretty substantial amount of shock on the sword. And so I turned it around, I smacked it on the spine, I smacked it on the side, and the sword didn't break. And so this is where I then said, okay, well, let me bring out another blade. And I brought out a previously broken Ronin katana Italian longsword, and I started hitting the edge into that. And what I noticed is that the edge didn't really deform any more than it was in the mild steel, as in it wasn't cutting. And now you notice that I'm not cutting into this sword in a way that's particularly aggressive. I'm not putting my whole weight behind it, though I don't know that a sword like this in this profile would be one that you would put your entire weight behind anyway. So I know I'm not using the movements correctly, and I'm not really chopping with a lot of gusto, but I felt that it was appropriate. And in doing this, I'm not seeing really much more edge damage than I'm seeing on the metal stake. Generally, though, if I cut into a sword and I kind of maim the edge significantly, if you will, along one side and then flip it around and strike it on the spine. It's a recipe to break swords. And I've done that with many swords, and this one did not break very easy. It took a lot of strikes, and I was about to give up on it, frankly, because the handle started exploding, and the wood here is relatively hard, and it creates some relatively sharp edges. So I put on a glove eventually, and I was thinking to myself, I'm going to stop because the handle has pretty much exploded, and it's not particularly useful, and I could be getting slivers here. But I put on a glove, and I thought to myself, well, if I was on some sort of battlefield or something like that, the handle exploding I would still be using it if it were functional, and the grip is still secured. It was still in, the sliver would only further secure it in my hand, so to speak. So I felt, all right, well, I'll keep going. And I did, and eventually the sword broke. But it took a lot of energy to break this thin sword, and I did not expect it to. I expected once I brought it to the metal pipe that it would pretty much be the end of the sword. I didn't even think I'd have to turn it on the reverse and break it. But that was not the case. Eventually, I did break the sword, and what I'm seeing grain structure-wise from the break in the sword is that it is a very tight, well-made grain. I don't know what to make of this little steel bit that I'm seeing where this is. I don't know if that is a flaw in the steel and part of why it broke here or not, or something that may have happened with what I was striking, because I was striking into other swords, and if it's maybe a chunk of another sword that's laid in there, not entirely sure. But what I will say is the grain structure of this particular one looks very, very fine in comparison to many of the other swords that I've broken, and that I'm assuming is likely one of the main contributing reasons that it took so very long to break, and I nearly gave up on it. Incidentally, tip, I know this is equally a thrusting sword, or could be. I thrust really with the tip one time into a metal pole, and it deformed very, very quickly. It could be buffed out, so to speak, not buffed out, but you could file this tip well again, but it really only struck the tip into the steel stake one time, and it rolled over pretty easily in that case. So I didn't do a lot of thrusting in it. Hopefully I've done enough already to kind of explain how I broke the sword, and in fairness, it took a lot more than I expected to get the sword to a point where it really had a critical failure. Critical in the way that, like, the blade would no longer function. There were obvious multiple failures in the hilt section. Of doom, so to speak. And I did a couple strikes in it, and initially it immediately scuffed the edge substantially. So through the wood cutting, it dulled a little bit, but still had a little bit of bite left on the edge. But as soon as I took it in the croquet stake with a kind of medium hard strike, it immediately took chunks of metal out of the sword, which is to be expected, but it was a pretty hefty chunk. Now, I had thought maybe I'm going to strike it into here and then take it back and chop some wood and see how well it does, but I didn't get that far. And so up into the croquet stick of doom, I would say the sword was performing spectacularly. I was really impressed with the edge retention. I was impressed with how much the sword stayed straight, and how well it absorbed shock, and how comfortable it was in my hand. But basically, a few strikes into the croquet stick of doom, and the sword broke, which is not great. It absorbed all the shock prior spectacularly well, and then failed catastrophically after a few strikes. Now, I would have hoped that the sword would have, had chunks or diminished or lost its edge, but not broken. I didn't even have to flip it around and strike it on the spine. It broke, cutting into the croquet stake. And I later repeated just to see if maybe there was some sort of structural weak spot. The grain structure looked good. I didn't spot anything terribly problematic, so I took it and I did it again. And it took a lot more strikes than it did the first time, but there's quite a bit less sword on it. So, and it broke. It broke without having to flip it around and strike the spine of the blade here. So I don't know if it's too hard or something, or that it's just particularly less resilient to metal objects. I'm not entirely sure, but I would say that it did not hold up particularly well on the striking the croquet stake of doom. And other swords have failed maybe pretty quickly on that target, but very often I have to turn them around and start striking the spine. This one, several whacks in, it just failed and kind of flung off in a helicopter of death. So that was the end of the sword. Now, do I think it held up? Just flip the tip of the water bottle off, and the neck area and the kind of screw-on cap area of a water bottle are much thicker plastic, and they're usually pretty hard, and if a sword's going to get damaged on a water bottle, it's usually in that area. So cutting horizontally through that area seemed to me like a good test of the edge. I did, and there was some minor edge deflection on the tip, presumably from that last cut, though I didn't see it mirrored. Usually, if it's going to chip, it kind of chips on two ends when you cut through the circle where it initially impacts, or something like that. But I usually see two chips when I do something, if the sword does chip on the water bottle neck. In this case, I didn't. So Again, worth noting, there was some edge damage, minor, could be sharpened out, and the sword, after doing those things, was still quite sharp. So at that point, I then took it to dried logs. So I have cottonwood and pine, and those are the two kind of branches or logs, if you want to call them that I was chopping into. And first I cut through the cottonwood branch twice. It's dead, kind of dried up wood. It's not particularly hard, but it's a reasonably hard wood. And I was chopping into it, and I moved through, and the edge was still very, very sharp. Now, the odd bit in this particular case is that I would slap the sword on the side of the cottonwood tree or on the side of my stand, and the blade would bend. And it took a bend relatively easily. It just took a slap on the side of the stand, and that's common with like differentially hardened katana. Those often take a set doing something similar. This took a minor one. It bent in a particular spot. It would bend back, and it was just easy. It took kind of a thwack on the side of the blade, and it would bend. And that would suggest to me that this is a soft metal, and soft metals typically lose their edge quickly. And so in chopping into the wood, I then tried to shave hair on my arm again, and it shaved. So it didn't lose, and obviously I haven't done a huge amount of chopping, but I chopped through the branch twice, then used that area and tried to shave my arm, and it was still shaving sharp, which would suggest to me that it has some level of edge retention, albeit those are not a huge amount of cuts, but I'm doing bad cuts into hard dry wood horizontally or sometimes with the grain, but not necessarily with a lot of care for the edge. When I continued to kind of strike and do intentionally really, really bad strikes, more intended to bend the sword than dull the edge, I did notice some edge dulling, but it was still shaving sharp, just not as shaving sharp. So it retained its edge actually surprisingly well, but it would bend very easily. And it's weird for me. I can't say I understand the steel well enough. I still catch myself all the time believing these misconceptions or assumptions about particular types of steel, and I would assume a soft steel would lose its edge quickly. If it bends really easy, it's probably not going to hold an edge particularly well. And this maintained a pretty razor edge through much of the wood cutting and still remained pretty sharp coming out the other end of it. And other swords have not done that with katana and the like. If they're made to be razor sharp and then I try to chop through tree branches and things like that with them, inevitably by the end of the test they don't shave necessarily. They'll still cut through paper, they'll still be very sharp, but they won't be effectively sharp to remove hair in a shaving motion. So that was surprising. I did not expect it. The edge did diminish, but not in a way that I would call particularly substantial. So bends really kind of easy and retains an edge reasonably well. And some of that is good and some of that is bad. I would say bending is not what I expected. Maybe for a through-hardened blade, I kind of expected it to be a little springier. That wasn't the case. It has kind of similar properties to what I would call differentially hardened blades in the katana realm that I deal with. It's pretty rare for me to take a non-Japanese, non-differentially hardened blade, smack it on the side of a stand, and have it take a set. That's odd, I guess I would say, given that these do not appear to be differentially heat-treated, and from the cross-section and the grain structure, it doesn't appear to be that way either. But anyway, oddities in the testing. I hope you find that information somewhat useful. I then, after chopping wood, decided to throw it at a tree. That's where I started to see the handle separate a little bit, where most of this damage started to happen with the grip diminishing. I wouldn't say that it took a bend particularly bad, and the tip remained pretty straight and sharp as well. It's not a particularly dainty tip, but it's worth noting I thrusted it into my stand, I thrusted it into a tree, I thrusted it into branches and kind of twisted. The tip didn't bend or deform in any kind of meaningful way, so it remained pointy, which is quite good. And I did some kind of glancing tip cuts, intentionally trying to bend the tip over or diminish it in some way, and it didn't do that. So that was surprising. And I found it very easy to index, very easy to thrust with, very easy to get that tip exactly where I wanted it to go. Not necessarily you're going to see that in the video, but I was surprised at how well it held up. So at this point in the test, I have some mixed feelings about it. It takes a bend easier than it should, but holds an edge better than I would have expected. In either case, it isn't a fragile little dainty thing. It's done sword-like activities like a sword should. You might not like that it bent a little bit, or you might be expecting the edge to hold up even better, but I was kind of thinking that stainless steel swords might be overly brittle and just shatter or break up before doing any of this kind of stuff. And it didn't. And you might have expected it to bend or flop over, be much softer, and it wasn't. It did sword-like activities. Taking a bend is something that happened to swords in history, happens with bad cuts to experienced swordsmen with good swords, and edge retention, at least as far as I'm concerned, seemed to be pretty good. Now moving on to the destruction portion, I took it to the croquet stake of doom, and interesting things again started happening here. So obviously I'm expecting it to be damaged. I hit the croquet stake of doom, and it produces a pretty sizable chip or roll or diminishment in the edge. It looked like a pretty sizable chip to me, and that the edge just clean broke off for the most part. About 1 millimeter deep, maybe a little bit larger, and a pretty wide section, the width of the croquet stake. It seemed to be biting into the croquet stake a little deeper than what I would typically see. The results in the croquet stake seem to be pretty substantial as well. Not a huge amount, but to some small degree, though maybe more surface areas contacting it, given that this is a recurved edge. I couldn't say for sure if that's the case. But the next thing that I'll mention is that obviously it damaged it pretty quickly. I was expecting that. It was falling in line there. Several other strikes, I continued to put a lot of force on the edge, and just chunks of it would break off. And there was one really big chunk that broke off that almost turned this into like a bottle opener looking kind of thing. A big old chunk of it, roughly about 1 inch across and maybe 1/2 or 1/4 inch deep, probably closer to 1/4 inch deep, right around the thickness of the edge, which I would call about 1/4 inch, broke out, and it was a sizable chunk. But the sword did not break when I continued to strike with that large bit of edge damage, and this chunk was stuck in the croquet stick of doom, which was kind of fun. It's not something that I've seen that big a chunk kind of bite out and remain in the metal target that I was cutting. So that was fun to see. I continued striking. It didn't break. I turned it around and kind of made a dramatic pose of turning it around and striking it on the back. And interestingly enough, it did not break. So if I do my little piece together thing here so that you can see where things broke. It did not. I was trying to break it. I thought for sure it would break where the large chunk had broken up, but it broke much further up on the tip area here. And so this was the first break. It came off up here, which was not what I was expecting, given that most of the damage occurred in a lower area. And then I turned it around and continued to strike, and I gave several more bits of edge damage, and then I flipped it around on the backside and continued striking, and you can kind of see where I did a lot of the damage, really kind of whacking it into the side. It took quite a while, and then eventually it broke again. Just not where I was expecting. I thought it would break here, live and learn, I guess. But in all cases, it remained still very chop-centric and effective. I mean, this could be really, I suppose, fixed to some degree. I could put a new tip on here, and then pound this handle back together and back into shape, and I'd be have a shorter weapon, but still something totally effective, something that wouldn't be certainly as good as it once was, but something that could still have some shelf life for some usage. So, and as it is, I can still hold the thing, albeit with the grip as it is, uncomfortably, and hit stuff with it. It's not as effective by any measure, but it's still to some degree functional, albeit at a reduced capacities. All right, so that's all the testing and usage that I have. Hopefully the video has given you enough information to decide if something like this is worth your money or not, but it's time for me to answer that question myself. Do I think it's worth the $250 asking price for the sword? And my short answer is yes, but I'm a little bit on the fence about it. It did do some things that surprised me. I did not expect it to hold up as well as it did. Thing that I wouldn't say would buff out, but that you could sharpen and continue using. I did several strikes on the edge, and at no point did it really go in more than 1 millimeter or maybe 1.5 millimeters in terms of edge deflection and damage into the edge of the blade. I did several more strikes. Obviously more damage occurred. I'm hitting at various degrees of hardness, but at no point am I really giving it everything I have. One, because it's very dangerous and I don't want it to fly back at me, so I'm trying to do it as controlled as I can. But it didn't really take any giant edge damage. No big chunks broke out. None of that kind of stuff. When I damaged the edge somewhat, I brought it back to some branches and stuff, just so you can kind of see it didn't cut through the branches the same way with the damaged edge. It would bite into them. It would still cut. It would still be quite lethal if that was a person, but not. It wouldn't cut through the branches the same way it did. When I tried cutting lower on the edge, it would sail through the branches again with that razor edge. So after cutting a couple branches, just in contrast to see, what that kind of edge damage does, I brought it back to the metal pole and I hit it a few more times and eventually it broke. Now the important note here is that I didn't have to flip it around on the spine to break it. And any sword would, potentially break on the croquet stick of doom. But very often I do enough edge damage, you know, there's no exact count of strikes that I'm trying to go for, but I have to flip it around to hit it on the spine to really expose those weaknesses and make it come apart, and I didn't have to do that here. So to me, I think this actually broke a little prematurely, and in looking at the cross section of the blade, the grain doesn't look as fine as it could, and there are some minor dark spots around it. I don't know if I can interpret those as fractures or cracks or problems with the steel. Obviously, it took a lot of punishment. It cut branches into tatami and did all the things that I was supposed to do, and it wasn't until several strikes in that it broke. But I would still call it a little bit premature for a katana that's, you know, as thick and, you know, substantial as this is. Even though it's a lighter on the scale of katana, most of the time I strike the edge, and when it doesn't show any damage like this, it's pretty rare for it to break. That it breaks the same way. I've got on thicker jeans, and I'm putting on some something that's going to be a little harder to cut through. So all right, hopefully my audio is picking up here. I am seeing a little bit of bending. It's kind of canted off to the side now. I'm going to strike on the side. Yep. Back to straight. Quite soft. Not bad, but so I missed once, and I did smack the brake, though it doesn't appear as hard. The edge has held up remarkably well, realistically speaking. I mean, this is very little damage for striking into the metal and the brass. I'm not seeing something that couldn't come out. So merit-wise, a little soft here, hard here. This seems like something that you'd be able to straighten out. Seems like something that you'd be able to sharpen and use. However, on abusive targets, obviously we've got some sort of problem that is not unique to the one that I had. Now this grain structure, from what I can tell, looks a little bit coarser. Maybe I'll line them up and lay them next to each other. But again, same thing. I'm not seeing anything inherently design flaw wise, right? This looks like a good meaty tang to me. It looks like it's relatively well pressure fit. I do see what looks like little welds here. Maybe that's reduced the structural integrity. And shows me basically is how much damage is going to happen to the sword from hitting into a softer metal but a thick piece of metal that is braced, and the edge does deflect and deflect meaningfully. I would say that it would certainly ruin your day, but at the same time it's still a weapon, it's still straight, and likely it's not really penetrating or deflecting more than 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter into the blade, and you could probably sharpen it out, though you would have to do a bit of work to do that. But it could still be fixed, and fixed by somebody with some reasonable degree of competence in sharpening. I don't necessarily have that, but that's at least my assessment there. I should also note, I've kind of forgotten at this point when I did it, but I chucked the sword at the tree, which is also customary. If you were riding it from horseback and chopping and dropped it or something, how well would it hold up, which is a totally realistic use case. I just chucked it at a tree, and it held up. It started to rattle a little bit, so the tsuba would rattle, but the kashiro didn't come off, the handle didn't have any kind of wiggle or anything to it, and basically the only thing that I would notice is that the habaki and tsuba would rattle a little bit after chucking it at a tree. Anyway, that's all in all. At this point in the test, I would say that I have done some very, very abusive stuff. I've chopped into logs, which you're not really supposed to do, but it should survive. I would call it abusive, at least the way I'm doing it, which is really bad cuts with the intention of seeing what happens. But realistically, it should be able to cut through that kind of stuff, and it did without a problem. Chucking at a tree, certainly abusive. It's going to make things rattle. It survived. Hitting brass fittings on a braced, stable surface, very abusive. Edge deflection is expected, though I would say it had a little bit more impact than I would have liked to see. What I'd like to see, since this is something that is relatively new to me to do, is still to be determined, but this had more damage to the edge than some of the harder materials that I've tested on previous swords, or other materials. I don't know about harder, but other materials. As I talk about hardness, if I take my HRC files and I scratch into it, it looks like the 50 file doesn't bite in and the 55 file does bite in, though neither one of them particularly well. The 60 file then bites in relatively easily. So to scale hardness, I'm still new to testing them with those hardness files. That's what I can tell you. Anyway, so after testing it on the brass fitting, it did deflect and damage the sword, and then I went into using the hardness test. Or rather the croquet stake of doom, which typically breaks the sword. Before I move on to that, though, I do want to note that test has broken other swords cutting into the brass file or brass fitting, because that is a braced stand that is just sitting there, not doing anything, and it causes a lot of vibration, and all the impact is in the sword, right? It doesn't move. The edge deflection isn't surprising, but it's broken other swords at the hilt, and if there's any fatal flaws in the sword, chances are it's going to fly back at me, hence the ridiculous outfit that I'm wearing. Anyway, it survived that. It did all the things that it was supposed to do, and it had about 1 millimeter of edge deflection to it after cutting in the brass fitting. So I move on to hitting the croquet stake of doom. Now, in doing this, I start seeing penetration in the edge, or deflection or chipping in the edge, up to about 2 millimeters. That's about probably the most. I would say most of it is really about 1 millimeter deep still. So it's taking big chunks or deflections out of the edge, but they're relatively small in scale and could still be fixed. And from there, I turn it around and start smacking it on the spine. And this is typically the recipe that I use to break a sword. Most of the time, once I flip it around after damaging the edge, I can smack it on the spine, and it will at some point break after a few strikes, sometimes even only one strike. So I progressively start hitting it harder. Now bear in mind that these swords tend to fly back at me, so I'm not hitting it with like every ounce of strength that I have. I'm trying to maintain control, trying to keep my shoulder positioned so that if a sword flies back at me, it's going to hit some bone and not some vital organ kind of thing. And I'm trying to maintain what little control in the scenario that I do have. So I'm not swinging for the fences, but I'm swinging with force. Eventually I engage my hips, and you can start to see it more. You can see the stand move, and hopefully that gives you some idea of how hard I'm hitting, but I would say reasonably hard. Hard enough to cut through a tatami mat, hard enough to cut through probably a few of them. So anyway, from there, it does not break, and that is not a first, but I would say a rarity. And so I take out another sword. I bring out an old 1075. This was the Ronin Italian arming sword. It's now used to hold up things in my garden, and it's relatively rusty, but it's still made of 1075 through hardened steel. I prop it up, strike into it. Now I'm doing probably 4 or 5 millimeter chunks of this sword breaking out, but it's rusty and it's been sitting outside, so how meaningful that is, I don't know. But it's cutting deeper into the Ronin through hardened sword than this one is. This is suffering relatively like a 2 millimeter deep gash into it, maybe 2.5 millimeters, but the Ronin is getting 4 or 5 millimeter chunks popping out of it. So worth noting that the damage was worse to the sword that I was striking. So after I do that a few times, the sword again does not break, but it simulates basically hardened steel on hardened steel versus hardened steel on mild steel. And so obviously the sword is going to be damaged, but not much more than it already was, in fairness. So once I do that, I take the sword away. It's not breaking the sword. I test it by striking the spine of the sword on the croquet stick of doom, and eventually it breaks. But again, I have to hit it relatively hard to get it to break. I'm gradually stepping up how hard I'm hitting it, and I have to hit it pretty hard to break the sword. And so all of those things combined mean that this sword took more punishment to break than any sword that I've tested with this methodology. Introducing the brass fitting is somewhat new, but it did cause other swords in the past to break. And the croquet stick of doom is usually enough to break the sword. Very often I don't have to break out another sword-on-sword contact in order to damage the edge enough to cause a potential fracture by striking the spine. Usually I can diminish the edge and then strike the spine, not even as hard that it springs back to shape readily. It took a set, and that's something that I actually noticed in tossing the sword. The next thing that I did is I threw the sword at a tree, and that's where I noticed that the pommel was hollow. It stayed on, it stayed tight, but it took a big dent in the pommel, or the little end cap area. The sword didn't necessarily bend, but through several tosses, I noticed that things started to loosen up a little bit, as well as in one case, the sword landed in kind of the stump of the tree, and it bent the tip pretty aggressively. Now, I could straighten that out with one of the branches that I cut and just smashing it back into shape, but the sword did take a bend relatively easily. Well, I won't necessarily call it easily. I had to hit it pretty hard on the stand, and it had to have its own weight and momentum to bend the tip, but it would bend rather than spring back to shape, and I would say maybe easier than you might expect from a through-hardened steel. Anyway, once I did those tests, which I'd say it held up to actually pretty well, and actually surprisingly good at cutting, surprisingly good at edge retention, surprisingly good at not taking damage in some of those things, or bends, some of the really bad cuts that I threw at chopping logs, but it did bend a little easier in terms of intentionally trying to put a bend in it. From there, I took it to the brass fitting on a old water heater base that's braced. It did diminish the edge in doing that, but nothing rattled apart. And that's where I would say if this was a concern, it would have kind of cracked apart. It puts a lot of stress right on the handle. There's a lot absorbed in the sword, and if it's going to break at the handle, then it would have done it, or could have done it on that portion of the test. It diminished the edge, and I would say it in a way that is reasonable. From there, I brought it to the croquet stake of doom, several hard strikes, and eventually it broke. Now, it didn't have to be turned around on its spine to break the sword. I was able to break it just by impacting the croquet stake of doom, but a couple things to note there. One, it took a lot of strikes. Two, I had to strike it pretty hard. And three, it's freezing outside, and so that's not helping the sword in terms of it not being brittle. So bear those things in mind. Overall, I would say for the money, it held up really, really well, and it was a much more fun cutter than I gave it credit for. I didn't like the feeling. I thought it was kind of cumbersome in the hand, but I imagine if this were cut off and you shaved down the handle a little bit, if you're willing to do some of that work yourself, it was a fun tool to move around. It would still, even if I could get a grip on it, it would fundamentally change how good it felt in my hand, but it would still be a heavy sword at the end of the day. I did find after moving it around, though, that it became a little bit more fun. I didn't notice that my shoulder was fatigued in doing the testing that I was doing, but I also didn't practice with it doing any kind of martial arts for, an hour or so beforehand, which is customarily what I tend to do in these reviews, is I move it around and I practice with it and I get a feel for moving it. But my shoulder didn't fatigue in smacking it into things. So strikes a bit of a cant, and then it was just striking it on the reverse to straighten it back out. So I could force it to bend, but it took a lot of pressure to do so, and multiple strikes along the flat of the blade into a large 6x6 stand that I use. Okay, so up until this point, I just want to preface, I've cut pool noodles, I've cut water bottles, I've cut tatami mats, and it bats them around. It doesn't really lose the edge particularly easily, except for oddly enough on a steel can. It's holding up really well. The tip seems really durable. It's also pretty rigid, easy to thrust, and it doesn't flex a whole lot, but it doesn't cut particularly well either. After I've done that, I want to note that I throw it at a tree several times, and this, what it usually does is either bend stuff or rattles things apart. It causes the grip to come undone and things like that. It held up really, really well through the multiple tosses that I threw at it. Everything remained quite tight. So I brought it to the croquet stake of doom, and this is usually enough to break a sword. Again, bear in mind, it is a cold day in Minnesota when I'm testing this. That usually makes the steel a little more fragile, a little more brittle. In this case, it didn't. Now, it bit into the sword more than other targets had. It obviously deformed the edge, and that's expected. But despite repeated strikes in one spot, it didn't break. Flipping the sword over to the opposite side and striking it, again, is usually my recipe to break swords, and in this case, again, it didn't. I repeated several strikes with as much force as I'm comfortable with. Now, as I'm striking this croquet stake of doom, I'm expecting it to break, and it's a little hard to control here because there's weird angles. Chunks of the tip have flown back at me at times, and so I'm exercising as much force as I can while simultaneously feeling like I have some amount of control in where that broken tip is going to go. It doesn't break, though, so I break out another old rusty sword that I use in a planter box for flowers. Now it's a 1075 through hardened blade. Several strikes again on that sword. It bites in and it makes deeper gouges into the Dark Sword Armory blade. And then when I bring it back to the croquet stake of doom, this is like a tried and true recipe to break swords. I've now deformed the edge, hopefully made some cracks in it. Striking on the reverse side on the croquet stake of doom eventually breaks the sword. But it's worth pointing out kind of where it broke. Now, it broke kind of out at the tip here. Most of where I'm striking was here, and then it kind of broke out at the tip, and mostly what I was left with was still a pretty functional sword. I don't know how this would necessarily be salvaged in a way that's meaningful, since it has a very prominent central ridge, but anyway, broke out at the tip. I would say the last 6 inches or so of the blade broke off, and I still had a reasonably functional choppy chop weapon in my hand, but obviously that was what I was going for. I was breaking it. What I noticed about the grain structure as well was that it seemed to be pretty fine, and that indicated to me that at least very likely that the heat treatment was pretty good. So from there, I was determined to test the quillions, because that was a point of fascination from the previous Alexandria review and something people like me to test on European-style swords. But last time I got some feedback that putting it into a drum that's braced and doesn't allow any flex is not necessarily realistic, and is maybe a little harsh on the quillions themselves, or at least it doesn't show how a human hand might impact them. And I don't have something that's really analogous to that, so I kind of propped it up on a branch and struck it with a katana, or a broken katana from a previous review. It's more of a wakizashi size, and I figure that I can get 2 hands on it, but I'm striking pretty shallow, so it's a softer hit than what you might experience in some sort of contact where somebody's using a long sword and has more leverage. But I'm also hitting it hard, and I have to be cautious because it turns into a helicopter of death and flies all over the place. So I would say that this is softer. It's not braced really at all, and take from that what you will. In this case, it bent. The quillions all bent. They didn't pop off and fly anywhere, and I would argue that they're probably softer than maybe they need to be. You can be a better judge of that. Each sword strike bit into the quillion pretty meaningfully and deformed it or bent it quite a bit. The harder I struck it, the further it would bend. But in either case, it didn't fly off into my pond or break. And if I struck hard enough and had a longer weapon, I think that it would maybe deform more meaningfully, but I think it would protect your hand. Especially the edge of mine bit in, and that would, I think, kind of do some strange things with the force, so to speak. In terms of where it bent the sword, I don't think that it would bend over all the way over your knuckles and cut into your hand or something like that. But it would likely deform perhaps more than well tip-wise. But when I would chop into something, I'd try to bend the blade, and I bent it at times quite far, and at no time did it take any noticeable bend or set. It always sprung back to right where it was. I was kind of hoping that I might work the warp out or change it in some way, but it came right back to where it was each and every time. Anyway, so tip-wise, I would thrust it into things. It held up really, really well overall. All right, so now's the part where I'm going to start really diminishing the edge. And the first thing that I do is I take the blade, I put it on the brass fitting on this old water heater drum that I have outside, and I baton it in. And that's where I start to see some chipping as well as some deformation, some rolling of the edge. Kind of did both in one piece, and maybe there's other chunks of sword stuck in that brass fitting, not entirely sure. But it really did deform after batoning it in one time. I then did another strike, kind of going back, just doing more of a wrist strike, and it didn't actually deform the edge or do anything to it. The edge seemed just fine. I could certainly see where I hit the brass fitting based on kind of some residue that was left there, but no damage. And then several more strikes in the brass, and I started to see smaller deformation, chipping, rolling, that kind of thing. Usually about 0.5 millimeter, maybe up to 1.5 millimeters in terms of depth. From there, I had a pole, and I was looking for a pipe, and I didn't have one, but I did have like a steel pipe from the fence that I use for my little one to block off the gates for babies and stuff. Anyway, I brought that out, tried to chop into it. Again, it would bend the pipe, and I didn't spot a whole lot of deformation or anything like that, but it's pushing into the stand and giving a little bit. It rolls and has really similar effects to the brass fitting, but I would say maybe less meaningful given that the edge that I'm whacking it into is already deformed. It doesn't seem to go much further. The next thing that I did was break out the croquet stake of doom, and it's worth noting the croquet stake of doom is a sword breaker. I'm expecting it to break the sword at some point. Ideally, the furthest things have gone, the best performance I've experienced so far is having to strike the blade in the croquet stake of doom, it not breaking after 10 to 20 strikes, reversing it, striking the back of it, it not breaking out a sword for edge-on-edge contact, striking it, deforming the edge by hitting hardened steel against hardened steel on fine points, and then taking the spine and reversing it and hitting that metal rod again. That's as far as it's gone. And this one didn't make it that far. It took one strike and then immediately started showing a much more significant problem. A chunk about 3.5 millimeters broke out of it. I went back to the croquet stake of doom after that, struck several more times, and that's what it took to break it. I didn't have to reverse it. I didn't have to break out a sword-on-sword kind of contact. But again, bear in mind, the fact that it makes it to the croquet stake of doom is a good thing. It's held up until this point. It's also very cold, and so I mentioned earlier that I'm testing it in the bitter cold. I've got a campfire going to keep me warm. Ice is forming from the melted snow from throwing it. The steel rod that's out there has been outside, and so everything's below freezing. That's what is worth noting. And I have a sneaking suspicion, without making excuses for this sword, that if I had tested this in the summer, I would have at least had to strike the spine of it. The cold, I believe, contributed to how quickly it broke, but I would still say that it held up pretty well. Anyway, that's a journey that it took to get to broken. Now's the part where I answer the question, do I personally think it's worth it or not? And this is easy to say yes to, though it does come in kind of two different flavors. One is just as it is. If this were on Quinn's website for $360, would it be worth it? On paper, I would have been detracted by the warp, but in hand, yes, it's easy to recommend. And you can see that it did all the important things well. It didn't vibrate or hurt my